Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of our NeuRAtalks webinar series for 2021. My name is Carole Renouf. I'm the Executive Director of the Neuro Foundation, and thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be holding two more of these sessions between now and November, and we'll be sending you a follow-up email after this one to alert you to the rest of the series and invite you to join us again. Share the link with family, friends, and colleagues. And I'll just take a moment to say that if you are in a prolonged lockdown along with us, I really hope you're managing to keep body and soul together. And I also hope that today might help a little. I aim to structure the session so that I've got about 20 minutes discussion with our panelists, followed by around 20 minutes for you to ask your questions. However, please don't wait until I throw the floor open to post your questions. Just use the Q&A feature because the chat box is disabled, and please don't raise your virtual hand. Use the Q&A along the way, although we won't pick up your questions until a little later in the piece. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our three esteemed panelists, and I'll be speaking with each of them in turn. Firstly, Professor Kaarin Anstey, who is Senior Principal Research Scientist at NeuRA, an Australian Research Council Laureate, Scientia Professor at the University of New South Wales, and Director of the Ageing Futures Institute. And Kaarin focuses on public health research into dementia risk reduction. Secondly, Dr. Claire Shepherd, Director of the Sydney Brain Bank and leader of the Shepherd Dementia Research Lab. And thirdly, Dr. Bill Brooks, Research Fellow, who has completed his medical training at the University of Sydney and has been studying families with the inherited forms of Alzheimer's disease since 1988. So I'll go to Kaarin first. Kaarin, Dementia Australia quotes figures of 472,000 Australians living with dementia and 1.6 million involved in their care. But there doesn't seem to be consensus around the scale of the issue.
That's right, Carole. So the figures are about 400 to 470,000 people living with dementia right now, but actually our data is drawn from Europe. We don't have an Australian dementia prevalence study. We're still depending on estimates. So I think many in the audience will have noticed dementia was actually in the census this year, and a number of us are trying to gather better Australian data through things like the census, through looking at death records, linked Medicare data and so forth.
Okay, so we might get to a more accurate number soon.
Yeah.
You were involved in the World Health Organization guidelines for risk reduction for cognitive decline and dementia. And you also chair the International Research Network on Dementia Prevention. Just how much dementia can actually be prevented?
That's a good question. So we think that the modifiable risk factors for dementia collectively account for about 40% of cases of dementia worldwide. So this is very aggregated data, and there's variation between countries when you look at different risk factor profiles and so forth. But a number of groups have now settled on a figure around about 40%.
Okay. All right, so what does the evidence tell us about the best risk reduction strategies, and can you let us into the secret?
Yes, so the WHO guidelines are a really good place to start to look at the best evidence for risk reduction, because these guidelines focus on evidence of interventions that actually work. So they're not just looking at the things that increase risk, they're looking at randomized controlled trials that led to a reduction in risk of dementia. And probably the number one intervention that we can all participate in is physical activity. So there's evidence showing that meeting the national guidelines for physical activity can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's over 5 years by about 30%. compared to people who do not meet those guidelines. So those guidelines in Australia involve moderate physical activity for about 150 minutes a week, or vigorous for 75 minutes per week, and ideally some resistance training as well. So it's really something like a brisk walk of 20 to 25 minutes a day for physical activity. In addition, guidelines recommend eating a healthy diet and following a Mediterranean-like dietary pattern. So that includes green leafy vegetables most days, nuts, fish, olive oils, and low amounts of processed food. Then there's things like not smoking, and they recommend interventions to reduce harmful alcohol intake and management of vascular risk factors such as high cholesterol, hypertension, and diabetes, maintaining a healthy weight. And we also know that keeping mentally active, so they do recommend, with weak evidence, brain training. There's also depression. So it's unclear how effective treating depression is to prevent dementia, but we know depression does increase risk of dementia. So we are looking at that as another area for intervention.
Okay, well, I'm hoping that we're all exercising our brains this morning, or this afternoon, I should say, so we're lowering our risk of dementia. Kaarin, your research also focuses on developing and trialling tools to help people with early dementia and their carers, and also to help people with mild cognitive impairment. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we have two really exciting projects underway at the moment in this area. The first one is called SHAPE, and it's a project for people with early dementia, so who've recently received a diagnosis. And the whole focus of the program is to support people to live well with dementia. It involves joining a small group with other people with early dementia and learning about healthy lifestyle and coping strategies. And it's all conducted online, so it can be done during COVID. Our second project is called My Coach, and that's for people who are noticing some problems with their thinking and memory, or who've been told by their doctor that they have some mild cognitive impairment. So over the age of 70, we know that about 20% of the population have mild cognitive impairment. That's not dementia. So there's a lot of people in this group for whom a risk reduction intervention could really be beneficial and either delay or reduce their risk of developing dementia. And that involves an online course learning about modifiable risk factors, memory strategies, and also a session with an exercise physiologist to develop an exercise program that's tailored to the individual, and a session with a dietitian that's also focusing on a brain health diet for the individual. That can also be done online. So both of these programs have been developed during COVID. We've had to really adapt. So we've made these interventions programs that people can undertake at home.
That sounds terrific. And I know you're actively recruiting for trials in those two areas at the moment, aren't you?
Yes.
So for our audience, when you get your follow-up email tomorrow, there'll be an opportunity to join up to Kaarin's trials if you would wish to do so. Thank you very much, Kaarin. I'll now turn to Claire. Claire, dementia is many diseases, although Alzheimer's is the most common. What forms of dementia does the Brain Bank support research into, and what are the differences between them?
Yeah, as you say, dementia is an umbrella term for a loss of cognition, which is our ability to think and reason. And Alzheimer's is the most common, but we also study dementia with Lewy body disease and frontotemporal dementia. So in the ways that they differ, if we look down the microscope at the brains of individuals that have died of this disease, we see they have different pathologies. So that means that the cellular changes that we see are different for each disorder. And it's these changes that we use to diagnose the disorders. As a result of these different cellular changes, the clinical disease can also look quite different, especially at the early stages. So in Alzheimer's disease, we know it predominantly affects in the early stages regions involved in memory. And so individuals usually often present with forgetting. But frontotemporal dementia in the early stages predominantly affects the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes are involved in things like language, planning, behavior, reasoning. And so some individuals with frontotemporal dementia will have language problems or behavioral problems. And so it's important that we don't study dementia as a generic disease necessarily, but that we treat the individual diseases, because they're likely to have different causes and maybe different treatments as well.
Okay. I found an interesting fact. I understand that Alzheimer's was actually first recorded in 1907, but it wasn't until the 1970s that it was recognized as not a normal part of aging. So as a, pathologist trained person, specialist, I should say, can you take us on a journey inside the aging brain first, and then in contrast inside the brain with Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so our brain ages just like our body ages, I guess, but in the brain we have nerve cells, and it's important for those nerve cells to talk to each other. We know as we age that some connections between those nerve cells are lost. So normally a nerve cell may have thousands of connections with another nerve cell, gives us great resilience, great ability to learn and to adapt. But some of those connections are lost as we age. And I guess that's where some of that use it or lose it theory also comes in. We do have some changes in the cells in the form of abnormal protein buildup in our cells. So we have proteins that normally help our cells to function. And as we age, some of these proteins clump together in aggregates. But they're restricted and limited in their distribution. And importantly, they don't kill the cells or kill a large number of cells. So normal cell loss is not a general feature of the aging brain. If we contrast that to Alzheimer's disease, we get abnormal protein buildup in the form of amyloid and tau protein, which people might have heard of. If we think of tau like a ball of wool, tau is stretched out normally between nerve cells in a single line. In Alzheimer's disease, it becomes tangled in a ball of wool and stops the cells from communicating and functioning normally. And the amyloid beta protein, if we think of that like a puddle, it deposits between the cells and also affects the cell's ability to communicate. And this amyloid and tau accumulates in a progressive and a more aggressive way in Alzheimer's disease, such that it affects multiple regions of the brain and is quite widespread. And importantly, cells also die as a result of this process.
Okay, I like it. Wool and puddle. Good analogies.
Scientific.
So apart from its effect on memory, which is linked to changes in the hippocampus, some of the effects of Alzheimer's that we see are emotional and behavioral changes, sleep disorders. Well, what's going on there?
Yeah, we're still trying to fully understand the cellular basis of some of the changes that we see in dementia. But I guess just as the tau and the amyloid protein accumulate in the region of the brain that's responsible for memory, they also affect areas that are responsible for sleep, for emotional regulation, and for behavior. And they disrupt the normal function of these regions and sometimes kill the brain cells as well. And so when regions of the brain are affected by these changes, they can't function normally. The story is a little bit more complicated. There's some evidence to suggest that sleep disorders may precede Alzheimer's disease. And so it can be a bit of chicken and egg for some. I think the story is probably that there's a bit of both, and it may be different for different people.
Okay, thank you. And I'm curious to know, what are you researching specifically in your lab?
Yeah, I've had a long-standing interest in the role of the immune system and inflammation in neurodegenerative disorders. For a long time, it was considered a bystander of the disease process, and that inflammation just occurred as a result of the amyloid and tau building up. But there's now increasing evidence to show that the immune system and inflammation actually play an active role in a number of disease processes. So I'm interested in understanding what are these changes that occur, and what downstream effects do they have.
Okay, so thank you, Claire. I might turn now to Bill. Bill, apart from the rare people that you study with familial disease, it's still not known why one person gets Alzheimer's late in life and yet another doesn't. Where are we in understanding the factors that could be involved, you know, be those environmental, biochemical, etc.?
Well, yes, on an individual level, there's no single modifiable risk factor that you can put your finger on and say, as you can say, if you want to prevent lung cancer, we'll give up smoking and that'll take care of most of the risk. But as Kaarin mentioned, the WHO guidelines mention a handful of factors: physical activity, healthy diet, avoiding smoking and excess alcohol, healthy weight, blood pressure control, and particularly education. Of course, you have to do that starting early in life, but they're based on evidence from mostly from randomized controlled trials, and that evidence is strengthening all the time. I suppose a couple of years ago, the first really major one was a study called FINGER from Finland, and that study was so exciting that it spawned a whole lot of other larger studies to confirm and extend those results. And I think we'll hear a lot more about that in the years to come. Kaarin also mentioned the My Coach program, which individualizes those risk factors for people who have got a memory complaint. There is another genetic factor that's worth mentioning, and it's the ApoE4 genotype, and that's present in about 25% of our population. And people who have that particular allele, it's a normally occurring allele, it's not abnormal or anything, they do appear to accumulate brain amyloid more readily than people without this allele, and that process probably starts at 50, 55 and goes on for a couple of decades. Now, this might be relevant so far there's not been very much that we can do in the individual situation with that information, but with amyloid treatments for brain amyloid are starting to emerge now. I think we'll talk about that in a minute, and that may actually up the ante in terms of testing people for the E4 allele. And that might be something relevant in the medium term.
Understood. And similarly, I think I'm right in saying that there's still no single diagnostic test for Alzheimer's now, and in fact, the definitive diagnosis can only be made post-mortem. Are you aware of any progress with diagnostics?
Yes. Now, of course, to an individual who actually has dementia, it may not be all that important whether they've purely got Alzheimer's disease, particularly if it's very late in life. There are often multiple processes involved, which Claire would know all about. But talking specifically about Alzheimer's disease, which is the hallmark or main hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is amyloid. There have been PET scans have been available using amyloid tracers, and they've been available for some years now. Now they're expensive and complicated, and they're not available everywhere. And they have a place in diagnosis, although they're not necessary for everybody. They've been more a research tool. They might be more relevant if amyloid busting drugs become an accepted treatment. Now, beyond that, though, the interesting development is that it's also becoming possible to measure some of these amyloid and tau biomarkers in the blood. Previously, it was possible to measure amyloid and tau in the blood, but it didn't seem to make any bear any relationship to what was happening in the brain. But with recent studies have found that that there are some substances that can be measured that do seem to be relevant, and I think we'll hear more about those in the next 2 years or so.
Okay, so sounds like some movement there. Let's move on to treatments, because I'm aware that that's probably the thing our participants are most interested in. Can you explain to us the function of cholinergic drugs and how effective are they in improving cognitive function?
Yes, well, those are the first drugs to be approved for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, and they came on the market about 20 years ago, and they're called cholinesterase inhibitors. The first one was donepezil, and then a couple of years later, rivastigmine and galantamine. There are 3 main ones on the market. Now, one of the main neurotransmitters, that's the way that the nerve cells talk to each other through messenger chemicals in the nervous system, one of the main ones is called acetylcholine. And we think that in the brain, it's quite important in proper memory function, along with other things. And some of the nerve cells producing acetylcholine are particularly affected in Alzheimer's disease. And these drugs were developed to increase the effective amount of acetylcholine by blocking the enzymes, which are called cholinesterases, which break it down. So it doesn't actually stop the disease process, but it does cause a sort of functional improvement, and it doesn't work dramatically as had been hoped, but around about 60% of people who take these drugs do notice a meaningful improvement in their symptoms, but not everybody does. But they're certainly worth trying if you've got Alzheimer's disease, and give it a go for a couple of months and see whether you notice a difference.
Okay, and lastly, you recently finished a clinical trial which lasted about 4 years, and the results were published just this June. They showed a significant effect on brain amyloid levels. Can you let us into any secrets there?
Yes, well, it's not secret now because it's all published.
Okay.
But yes, this was called the DIAN-2 trial, and Neura was one of 3 Australian sites, and there were 25 sites in 7 countries, because it involved quite a rare group of people, people from families with a purely genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. And we've been involved with some of those families for over 30 years. And the people who were given, people who were randomized in the trial had a parent or sibling with a known causative genetic mutation. So they were at risk of developing, laying down amyloid because of a genetic process, that was abnormal. And every month for 4.5 years, people in the trial were given one of 2 drugs aimed at removing amyloid, or else they were given a placebo injection or infusion. And the results showed that one of the 2 drugs was quite successful in removing brain amyloid. Now, unfortunately, we didn't see any effect on memory and thinking, which was disappointing, although there are some reasons why that was the case, and I wouldn't give up on it yet. But the other thing that was very encouraging was that although the treatment was directed specifically at amyloid, there was also an effect on another important pathway in Alzheimer's disease. Remember, Claire was talking about the puddles and the wool. Well, the wool is the tau tangles that are inside the nerve cell. And we think that, well, they certainly have a very important part to play in Alzheimer's disease, and there was an effect of this drug on this on the tau process, on some of the indices of the indicators of the tau process as well. So that was quite encouraging, and we do hope that further studies will actually be able to show an effect on memory and thinking.
Thank you. Just keeping a careful eye on the time. So in fact, I might cut short a couple of other questions that I had, but Kaarin, very quickly, our participants will have heard of the approval granted recently in the US for Biogen's, and try to pronounce this properly, Adukanyumab, hailed as the first new therapy for Alzheimer's in nearly 2 decades. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, Carole. So I'm not a clinician, but as a scientist, I personally would have preferred to see a bit more rigorous scientific data on the drug before it was approved. It's been very controversial for a number of reasons. There's been a lot of discussion in the newspapers, in the New York Times, in the top medical journals, controversies related to the endpoints used in the clinical trials, the fact that 40% of people on the high dose had quite significant side effects, and the cost. It costs $56,000 a year for US dollars for a treatment. And the approval process was also quite controversial. It was actually not approved in November 2020, and then the FDA did approve it this year. And 3 members of the advisory committee of the FDA actually resigned after it was approved. So, but part of the reason for the approval was the unmet need of patients, which is also very important. So it's been a very up and down journey. And I think there's been a very interesting article written in the New England Journal of Medicine that was published recently, and it did make an important point that regardless, if you sort of step back and look at the bigger picture, and regardless of the issues I've just mentioned, it does herald a new era for Alzheimer's disease, which is important. It's an important advance in using biomarkers in the role of diagnosis and in treatment and treatment monitoring. And it does open the door for progress for drug development in the field.
Okay, thank you. I'm thinking now we should move on to questions from our audience because they're flooding in. I'll try and direct each one to a particular panelist. So this is an interesting one. People die of dementia. It's a question. Is this a fact, or do people die with dementia? If they die of dementia, what is it that causes death? Claire, I might throw that one to you.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, doctors still do write Alzheimer's disease on death certificates. In reality, I guess the people lose their ability for a number of things, for self-care, for feeding, and they lose a lot of bodily, I guess, functions that are necessary to maintain health. And one of the most common things, though, that we actually do see our dementia patients die of is something like pneumonia. And so that's a more likely cause of death than the changes in the brain tissue, the brain cells itself.
Than the dementia itself. Yeah, yeah. Kaarin, I've got quite a few questions about your trials. For example, do you have to be over 70 to sign up?
No, I think it's about 60, 65 for our trials.
Okay, and what if I'm younger but feel I'm beginning to see signs of cognitive decline? I already see those in myself.
I'd say get in touch. Yeah, because we're interested in anyone with who's perceiving cognitive change. Yeah.
Okay, and also, are there any plans to commercialize these programs?
We have to prove efficacy first through a randomized controlled trial, and then we'll think about that down the track. But I think at the moment it's efficacy, and we'd like to have something that for example, GPs could refer patients to who have a memory complaint. They don't meet criteria for one of the drugs or treatments, but there's a lot they can do through lifestyle. We would refer them to one of our programs. That's the sort of longer term goal.
Okay, thank you. Bill, one here for you. Was the lack of effect on memory due to cells already having been killed by the amyloid that was then reduced by the drug?
Our trial was actually too small. Although there were 25 centres, these people are so rare that it wasn't actually big enough to detect an effect. And one of the things was it was actually designed as a prevention trial. So a lot of the people actually didn't have symptoms at the beginning, and they still didn't have symptoms at the end. So there was no actual separation between active and placebo drug. And the people who did have symptoms, which was a smaller group, about 40%, they actually had early symptoms at baseline, and they continued to decline. And but the Adukanyumab trial, which was a much larger trial, they did claim a statistically significant effect on difference in cognitive decline, but it didn't make them better. They just declined at a slightly slower rate, and the figures that they presented were not really dramatic enough to be important to most people.
Thank you. Claire, I think this one back to you. One participant interested in the link between inflammation and dementia. Is it about generalized inflammation in the body or inflammation just in the brain?
Yeah, we don't know all the answers to that yet. We have Alzheimer's disease patients do have inflammation in the brain. There is also some evidence to suggest that those individuals have changes in the inflammatory pathways in their body as well. But how the two are related is something that I guess we're just starting to unpack. We do know that some conditions have higher incidences of autoimmune disorder. So there's been higher incidence of autoimmune disorders reported in frontotemporal dementia, suggesting that some kind of systemic immune problem could be a precursor or linked to neurodegeneration.
Okay, thank you. Probably this one back to Kaarin. Why is there an increasing incidence of dementia, and is the increase in all regions of the world?
So what we're seeing here is actually an increase in prevalence. So the numbers of people, we're getting more and more people with dementia in Australia and overseas, and that's because of population ageing. So it's a sheer result of just having more old people, because the prevalence of dementia, it really is a disease that occurs mostly in older people. In their 80s, it's about 1 in 3. In terms of incidence, that's the probability, the rate of increasing conversion to dementia. There's kind of mixed results. So in some of the European countries, we've actually seen a decrease in incidence. And in some countries, we've seen an increase in incidence. And it's thought that this can be related back to some of these risk factors that I mentioned. So countries there where the education of the population has increased over the last 50 years, for example, and where there's better management of hypertension and vascular risk factors and reductions in heart disease and stroke, they're also starting to see a reduction in what we call incident dementia. So they're two interrelated concepts, but we're seeing increase in prevalence mainly due to population ageing.
Okay, understood. And I might stick with you, if you don't mind, for the next one. I think I know the answer, but I'm not going to chance getting it wrong. So back to the expert. In terms of the risk reduction strategies, do they only work for Alzheimer's, or are they equally effective for Lewy body and other forms of dementia?
It's a really good question. And one of the limitations of the intervention trials is the sample sizes are usually not big enough for us to subtype by dementia. And most of the dementia that we see is Alzheimer's, so about 65 to 70% of dementia is Alzheimer's. The second most common type is vascular dementia. So really those large risk reduction trials are really targeting, Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. So and even then they haven't actually subtyped, often not because of the funding and not having the biomarkers. So I guess we can't say if the same strategies work for the rarer dementias.
Okay, thank you. Bill, I might go to you for this one. Can you tell us about the value of wearing our hearing aids and the impact on dementia, and if this makes a difference?
I haven't got the statistics on hearing aids on me, but I'm quite sure that if you have impaired hearing, that has a significant social effect, and it has a significant effect on your ability to with memory and thinking. Now, I'm not aware of randomized controlled trials that take a group of people with hearing impairment and randomize some to having hearing aids and some not. But it's very logical. Certainly, impaired hearing is a risk factor to dementia, as far as I'm aware. So yes, if you need a hearing aid, get it.
So there is a link between hearing loss and dementia?
Yes. Now, whether impaired hearing causes plaques and tangles to form, amyloid and tau to form, it is perhaps not so biologically plausible. It's probably more keeping your brain, keeping all your pathways alert and functioning well, and the nerve cells talking to each other.
Okay, I wonder if it's like what Claire was mentioning in terms of the chicken and the egg with sleep disorders, which comes first.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got a really big question here, which might be perhaps a good one to kind of help us surf towards the end. But actually, to lead into it, I might just ask one more of my own first of each of you. Obviously, you're all working to change the future in terms of brain health. But what do you see as our best hope, Bill?
The people I work with have got a very significant, these are the people in the rare families, they've got a very significant biological cause for their Alzheimer's disease. And I can't see any way around them needing a biological, some sort of treatment to influence the disease process in the brain. But on a general population level, I think the things that the WHO is promoting, I think they are our best hope. And as Kaarin pointed out, the changes in education, changes in blood pressure and attention to risk factors have already, in some populations, like in Europe, shown a change, shown an improvement in the prevalence of a change in the prevalence of age-specific prevalence of dementia over the last couple of decades. So that's my thought.
Thank you. Kaarin, do you want to add anything to that? Our best hope?
Yes, Carole. Look, I think looking at the pandemic, bringing all things back to COVID, we've seen a absolutely incredible collaboration between science, government and industry to deliver vaccines, to deliver public health responses. I know that, they can be criticised, but this level of cooperation and collaboration, use of big data, use of modelling, it's really exciting. So COVID's going to go, it'll come under control at some point, and we'll be left with dementia as a major public health problem and a rapidly aging population. And so I'm just really hopeful that this new collaboration and rapid working together, using big data, bringing science with policy and industry to work together, I'm really hoping we can direct that towards dementia in the future and brain health.
Thank you. And Claire, what about you? Our best hope?
Yeah, I agree with Bill and Kaarin entirely. I think it's got to be a collaborative and multidisciplinary approach. And I think the risk reduction strategies are giving us a lot of information to point us towards the right areas to investigate, so we can reduce our risk by having an improved diet or lifestyle, and that will point to areas of the brain that are helped by implementing those strategies, that then we can potentially identify other therapeutic targets for to get at it in another way. So I think that that's really important. I mean, from a personal perspective as well, I see great hope in harnessing our own innate repair system, which is the immune system in our bodies, to utilize what we were born with to help us to repair some of the damage that occurs as we age, or some of the changes that we see as we age, you know, much like it's able to heal a cut on our bodies. Potentially, if we harness it in the right way, it can heal other damage in other organs, such as the brain.
Okay, I hope we've answered the big question, which was, what hope can we give to younger generations? You know, it may not be hope of a cure necessarily, but it sounds like there's a lot of hope around things that we can actually do, as well as progress in terms of the research. It reminds me of when my daughter was young, and I always used to try and explain to her that my brain was a room full of lots of different drawers, and there were lots of different things in each of the different drawers. And so I guess to run with that analogy, our aim is to keep the drawers, you know, just about full to the right level and not sticking and moving smoothly. And it sounds to me like with a lot of the knowledge that you've given us today, we should be able to do that. So look, now it's my role to bring this second NeuRAtalks to a close. Please join me in thanking Kaarin, Claire and Bill for sharing their great expertise. And my thanks to you, our audience, for your engagement and input. Please look out for your follow-up email. And I do hope you'll join me again soon for our next NeuRAtalks. That one is going to be on the 6th of October, and we'll be focusing on staying mobile and managing falls and pain. Thank you very much, and goodbye for now.